Hey, Squeak. So just be aware, and you'll get a notice right now of that. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here to discuss how climate change impacts you now and will be impacting all of us in the future. I'm Elizabeth Cooper. I'm with the Consensus Building Institute, and I'm working with the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to help facilitate these conversations. It's great to see many new faces and some familiar faces from previous conversations. Let me just walk through a few logistics of our technology here. This meeting is being interpreted into Spanish. Please, in a moment, select your preferred language by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. And a note, English speakers need to select their language as well.
Hola, bienvenidos. La reunión está siendo interpretada simultáneamente. Si usted desea escuchar esta reunión en español, en un momento van a ver que va a aparecer un globo en la pantalla inferior. Por favor, seleccione el globo y el idioma español. Si usted está usando la interpretación, por favor, déjenos saber por medio del chat. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Juliana. So that interpretation button should be available now. Great. A few other Zoom logistics. Please stay muted when you're not speaking. We'd love it if you can use video so that we can all feel a little more connected if that's available to you. Feel free to use the chat at any time to ask questions. And if you'd like to speak verbally, see the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, press that, and there's a raise hand button. This meeting is large, so I can't see all of your tiles at any one time, so that that raise hand button is helpful for me to make sure I find you. If you have any technical
Si tienen problemas,
and she will connect you to someone who can help you out. So we did not receive any interpretation requests for this meeting. However, if you need language interpretation accommodations other than Spanish to participate, please email Carolyn Mecklenburg at the address on the screen to request a separate conversation with interpretation. We'd be very glad to follow up with you and hear your input. We will also put that email address in the chat. So let me just review a little bit what we'll be covering today. We've done a brief welcome and getting oriented. Hopefully we've accomplished that for you now. Then we're going to give an overview of the assessment process and our progress to date. We'll share what we have learned in the assessment so far and how we have incorporated community input to shape our emerging priorities. What we've been doing is working to better understand the range of climate impacts that we experience across the state and who and what is affected. And now we're looking at how those climate change effects impact different sectors across the state. We'll give you a little bit of background on that. And then we'll move into discussion groups where we'll have an opportunity to hear from all of you. And those groups will be roughly sorted by region so we can hear more directly about how impacts differ across the state. And first, we want to discuss important places and cultural resources that may be
lugares importantes y recursos.
This is about understanding how you interact with the environment around you and what spaces or activities that are important to you in your culture might be impacted by climate change. We'll discuss this more at the time, so if you have questions about that topic, we can address them then. And then if there's any time after that discussion in your discussion groups, you could also look at the emerging priority impacts that we'll be sharing with you today and have a little bit more time to discuss those. And then we'll briefly return to plenary to just discuss next steps and close. So just a little guidance for how we can engage with each other today. Briefly, we ask you to be present. Let's try to keep our attention together so we can have a good discussion. Intent versus impact is a two-part request, and it's about how communication can really be imperfect, which is especially true on Zoom, unfortunately. So let's be aware that what you intend to say may land differently on another person because we all have different experiences and different communication styles. And similarly, be mindful that you may not fully understand someone else's intent when they speak, and let's all keep a sort of open and curious mind to seek to understand each other and bridge those gaps. Make space and take space means we want to hear from everyone, and we have a large group. So please share the chat channel and the microphone so that we can hear from everyone. Let me turn it over to Margot to share a little bit about the purpose of today's discussion.
Great. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or EEA, I want to welcome you to this conversation on the Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment. We have gathered here this morning to seek your assistance in prioritizing statewide climate impacts and discuss regional concerns. My name is Margot Mansfield. I'm a coastal hazards and climate specialist with EEA. I'm joined today by project team co-leads Marybeth Groff of MEMA, who is leading the formal update of the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. I am also joined by Carolyn Mecklenburg of the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Our primary consultant team is led by Industrial Economics and supported by the Consensus Building Institute and Eastern Research Group, who will be facilitating our conversations today. Today we are building off of our first wave of public meetings that we held back in March. In recognition of having new folks joining us this morning, we will start off with an overview of the climate change assessment. The overall purpose of the climate assessment is to develop a fuller picture of the climate impacts we face in the Commonwealth and how they affect different communities across the state. Today, we will be seeking your feedback on specific impacts in different regions across the state and how we should prioritize climate impacts that will be included in the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, otherwise known as SHMCAP, which Massachusetts must submit to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, in order to receive disaster funding from the federal government. In particular, we want to prioritize addressing impacts that fall most heavily on communities like those categorized as environmental justice or socially vulnerable communities that will need more support adapting to these worsening impacts. Thank you in advance for your participation today. Your input during this discussion section is critical to help us move forward with the next phase of the assessment. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Elizabeth.
Sorry, I was stuck on mute there for a second. Thank you so much, Margot. Let me now share a little bit about how the assessment process works. So where we've been, our first phase was focused on identifying impacts to communities and exploring the range of impacts and really looking to input from community stakeholders like you to uncover what we might not know about how communities are experiencing climate change. And so we did several things there to integrate the sort of best available information. We reviewed existing research, previous community input from other processes, and existing vulnerability assessments at the local and state level. We used community knowledge by talking with you to gather your input and clarify how you experience climate impacts now and what your concerns are for the future. And then we took all of that input and we categorized it for the purpose of the analysis into sectors and regions. And we'll walk you through that more shortly. So we're in the second phase now, which is looking at the where, how, and who, which is figuring out where impacts show up across the state, what sectors they affect, who is impacted. And in this step, we are prioritizing impacts by sector and determining who is impacted most across sectors and regions. The next phase after this will be drafting the assessment and then coming back to communities to ask, what did we miss? So we'll be developing draft findings and ranking of those priority impacts, and we'll come to you to ask for your help refining those. And then finally, that assessment will be integrated into the state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. And that's where we figure out what we need to act on and what needs to be addressed first in our adaptation plans. Let me now turn it over to Jackie to share more about the assessment process and the information we're analyzing.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Wilworth, and I am with Industrial Economics, or IEC. So in our last conversation that we had back in March, we talked about the impacts of climate change focused on 5 key climate hazards in the state. And those are heat, which could be general warming, as well as more frequent days with extreme heat, flooding along rivers, as well as backups in overwhelmed drainage systems, drought, storms and extreme weather, and sea level rise, which can result in permanent flooding, as well as increase in flooding at high tide events. So areas that used to flood maybe once a year could start flooding more frequently, monthly or more. We also discussed how these hazards can occur at the same time, which can cause even bigger problems. For example, a big storm on top of sea level rise would cause more flooding, or a high heat day during a drought can exacerbate effects. And then as a group, we brainstormed the effects of each of these hazards and highlighted the impacts that were most concerning. We also discussed how in this assessment, we are categorizing impacts into 5 sectors, which are shown here. Those are human health and welfare, infrastructure, environment, jobs and economy, and governance. And assigning the impacts to these sectors helps us prioritize action and determine who is responsible for moving adaptation actions forward. So for example, if we look at the many effects of sea level rise, we can assign each of these effects to a sector. So here, the relocation and displacement of communities falls within the human health and welfare sector. Direct flood damage to buildings and roads is within the infrastructure sector. The loss of tax dollars is in the governance sector. Competition for undeveloped land is in the natural environment sector. And finally, business closures and interruptions during flooding events are in the jobs and economy sector. So your input in the previous discussions helped us better understand how climate change is affecting currently and will affect communities in the future. And we use this input to develop a long list of climate impacts, all of which will be discussed in the state climate risk report. From that list, we developed a short list of 39 impacts that represent the biggest concerns we heard. And these 39 impacts will be the focus of our detailed risk assessment and will be prioritized for action in the SHMCAP. Again, impacts that are not in the short list will still be discussed qualitatively in the report. So next, I will walk through the shortlisted impacts by sector, which are shown here again as a reminder. And after showing each sector, we will pause to answer any clarifying questions. And we encourage you to use the chat to submit questions as we go.
Oops, sorry.
Okay. All right, so for the first sector, we will start with human health and welfare, which has 10 impacts shown in 3 groups here: health effects, public welfare or well-being, and public safety. And I won't go through each of these in detail, but I will highlight a few impacts in each sector. So under the health effects, the first impact listed is health effects from degraded air quality. And this includes outdoor and indoor air quality effects from things like ozone and particulate matter, as well as wildfires, which are all made worse with climate change. In this impact, we can measure premature deaths and also childhood asthma cases associated with climate change. And this is an example of how the impacts listed here often include multiple sub-impacts. And more detailed descriptions of each of these impacts are provided within the survey that is accompanying this, this meeting today that we'll talk more about as we go. Another example is under the public welfare category. We see the reduction in the availability of affordable housing. So in this example, the reduction in availability is caused by an increase in demand for affordable housing along with a decrease in supply. So the demand occurs when people are forced to relocate either due to direct damage to existing housing or because of climate-related economic pressures, or sometimes called climate gentrification. On the other hand, supply is affected by the direct physical damage from climate and potentially higher construction costs to meet climate resilient building codes. And so when there's more demand for affordable housing and less supply, this can cause the prices to rise, which makes the situation even worse. The final impact listed here is damage to cultural resources, and we will talk more about this in the breakout groups. But to highlight it here, climate stressors can damage important cultural resources that hold special value to residents of the Commonwealth. And everyone may hold different values for places, activities, and cultural landmarks that may be impacted by climate change. So I'll pause here for a moment to see if there's any questions.
Thanks. So I'll feel free to put questions in the chat or use that raise hand button at the bottom of your screen if you have any clarifying questions or comments regarding this human health and welfare set of impacts. John, I see noting in the chat other health effects, including access to pharmacies and medications and medical services, which could be interrupted. And a comment from Tony suggests differentiating natural environment from agricultural environment to emphasize food security risks. Thanks, Tony. And we'll be talking a little bit about environment and agriculture in a moment. And Karen is asking, have you looked at the effects of climate on our local food supply? So Karen, yes, I think that's what we're aiming to get at here towards the bottom of the screen there about food safety and security. Jackie, do you want to describe a little bit how we understand that local food supply?
Sure, and this will be an impact of, we'll think about the local food grown in the area, as well as what changes to growing conditions outside of the state might impact food supply and safety. And also consider where our food distribution systems are and the important infrastructure there and how those might be threatened by climate hazards such as flooding.
Great. And another question from Julie about whether drought is relevant for human health and welfare. Jackie, I don't know if there's a connection in these impacts or others that we discussed where there's a direct sort of link from, or, direct or indirect.
Yeah, certainly indirect. I think we'll see more about drought, especially in terms of water supply in the infrastructure sector. But in some sense, a lot of our impacts tie back to human health and welfare at the end of the day, which is why they are important to people to address.
Thanks. And just noting one other comment, and I encourage you to follow along in the chat. There's some interesting feedback coming in there from Shalini about availability of child and elder care in public welfare could be affected. And that's particularly a concern for vulnerable populations, as well as hospital access. And Shaila is noting this category is quite tied into environmental justice issues. Many of these impacts are experienced as much more extreme for people who are already suffering lack of access to various resources. So Shyla, thanks for raising that. It's a great point. And that's definitely something we are looking to capture in this assessment is, how can other social environmental conditions, really change how people experience these impacts differently and increase the vulnerability of some folks. And that's also something that we encourage you to provide feedback about in the survey to help us note. I think many of these are like that, as you noticed, but if there's particular impacts where you think that's especially a concern, we would love to hear that feedback in the survey that I placed in the chat. Great. I'm going to move us forward onto the next sector, and please keep the comments coming in the chat, and we'll also pause after this for a little bit of discussion as well.
Great, thank you. The next sector is infrastructure. And within this sector, we have impacts across energy, water resources, built environment, and transportation. Under energy, we have impacts to both the distribution systems, things like power lines, which can be affected with windstorms and extreme heat, and also energy production, which may cost more, particularly as demand for energy increases. The water resource impacts, first we have the reduction in clean water supply, as I mentioned in the previous sector, and this could both be due to droughts and potential pollution from events like algal blooms. Impacts in the built environment include inland buildings and coastal buildings and ports. And the majority of the damages we see and will look at are caused by flooding, but we will also consider wind damage, coastal erosion, and other hazards. And finally, in this sector, we also include impacts to transportation, including roads and rail, both the commuter rail, freight rail, the T, buses, all sorts of things. And I will just note that in the infrastructure sector, we account for repair costs associated with these events, but the follow-on impacts are often accounted for elsewhere. So for example, business interruptions caused by damaged buildings and flooded access roads are captured by an impact in the economy sector. And as we've already talked about, the relocation pressures after damaged buildings or damaged homes are captured in the human sector. So these are all related to one another, really. And I'll pause again for questions and comments on this sector.
Thanks. So all, any questions about what you heard about infrastructure here or anything you want to emphasize, kind of unpack? And just to note, following up on the comments regarding human health and welfare, Jim has provided a response, particularly about people who may be disproportionately affected, environmental justice communities, and people with disabilities. And we've heard some specific impacts, particularly for people with disabilities, about sort of susceptibility to power outages and ability to evacuate, and other issues regarding extreme weather. So that's definitely captured and forefront in our minds. Airports. Are airports accounted for in our category, in our impacts here?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. In our previous discussions, airports hadn't risen to the level of the priority impacts. However, they will still be discussed in the report. And also, we can look at just generally, we know where airports are, and we can see, the expected levels of flooding and that sort of thing to airports. But thanks for bringing that up, definitely.
Yeah. Wendy has a comment about damage to wastewater infrastructure resulting in public health risk. For example, a treatment plant being flooded and untreated sewage coming out can take several months to restore damaged biological treatment process. That's an important point. Thank you, Wendy. Sewer infrastructure, another comment there. So maybe we could address sort of sewer and wastewater infrastructure, how that's captured.
Yeah, and that I think will also come up later on in the governance sector, as many of these sewer infrastructure, wastewater plants are owned by municipalities. And so those are assets that we will consider in that, in terms of the governance impact.
Great.
Yeah.
And then bridges and culverts are being brought up, especially with sort of extreme precipitation or flooding. And I think that is, it's maybe captured in a few places because, like you said, it has economic impacts, natural environment impacts for aquatic connectivity, certainly infrastructure impacts. So that is definitely an important one. Thank you for raising it. Chris is pointing out vulnerability of wastewater treatment plants that are often in a flood zone, increasing the challenge we face there. And then several other comments coming in the chat here. I'm not going to try to rush through them all, but thank you so much. And let me see if there's a question we can address. Oh, Shalini's raising a point about medical records being interrupted or destroyed by extreme events. So, and I don't know if that's already been captured, but we'll certainly note it. Telecommunications, or did that not rise to being a high-level priority?
Yeah, and I will also note my colleague Jim Newman is here and he's responding to some of these in the chat if we don't get to answer everybody's question in real time. But yes, I see he answered that question. So yes, we do include those.
Thank you both. And then Ben is raising a kind of general question about not only climate change impacts, but disruption of basic lifestyle. And do we have sort of adequate parameters to describe that? Ben, that is a great question. And it's hard to sort of quantify something as broad as that. Our hope is that by naming sort of specific impacts about, how people's energy reliability is affected, how, ability to get to the grocery store, like many sort of day-to-day activities that for a person may or may not be sort of a big threat, but it's certainly disruptive. And our hope is that the assessment is capturing that range. And Chris, yes, the increased demand for electricity in summer is definitely within that category of loss of energy production and resources. Sort of both increased demand and interrupted supply are reflected there. And Jim and I are just on the same wavelength here. Okay, let me move us forward so we have time to discuss the remaining sectors.
Okay, so the next sector is natural environment. We have 3 categories in natural environment. First, in the terrestrial or really inland environment, impacts include freshwater ecosystem degradation, impacts to rivers, reservoirs, lakes, and ponds. We will also look at forest health generally. Next is the loss of urban tree cover, which we know are particularly vulnerable to heat and drought. And finally, soil erosion along riverbanks, but also in forests, near agricultural lands, and elsewhere. In the coastal environment, we will examine impacts to coastal wetlands and also coastal erosion, which will include areas such as dunes, banks, beaches, and rocky shores, thinking about impacts of sea level rise and storm surge. And we'll look more generally at the marine water ecosystem degradation, looking at hazards like ocean temperature change, ocean acidification, and increasing runoff in nearshore areas, which can affect the habitat quality. And finally, across all types of environments, we'll look at the impacts of climate change on species distribution, both plants and animals. And this impact covers both how invasive species may make their way into the state with changing climate conditions and how native species will be affected both directly by changing climate conditions and also because of the competition from invasive species in the area. pausing again.
Thank you. Any questions or comments here on natural environment? Great. See a number of comments in the chat. Peggy's raising a question about wildfire hazards, so maybe we could address that. And then Chris is raising that marine water ecosystem degradation could include pollution by nutrients and contaminants of emerging concern, et cetera. Right, if there's increased risk that facilities could be exposed to flooding, certainly that can then impact marine life. And Linda's asking a question about loss of biodiversity. And Linda, let me, thank you for raising that. And I think during the last wave of discussions related to the natural environment, we heard concerns about biodiversity loss and general kind of broad scale ecosystem stress or even ecosystem collapse. And so our hope is that right now, the way we're discussing natural environment, we've sort of named very specific impacts so that we can measure them and plan to adapt to them. But we are also thinking sort of holistically about the cumulative impact of all of these stressors on the natural environment and how that can affect biodiversity and the general health of ecosystems. Wildfires, do you want to address that, Jackie?
Yeah, I was just going to say that some of these impacts have a lot of pieces to them. So for example, the forest health degradation, we'll be thinking about the biodiversity changes in these forested areas as part of that. And also thinking about multiple stressors, one of which is wildfire. So that will be considered within that forest health degradation impact.
Great. And then Tony's raising impact on fisheries and fish and shellfish farming. Tony, great point, and we'll actually talk more about that in the upcoming economy sector, I believe. John is talking about multiple sources of stressors on urban tree canopy. Thank you. And then Shana is pointing out animal welfare impacts on individual animals as well as species-wide concerns. Thank you. And the fact that shifting species can impact agriculture. Thanks, Brian. All right, and I see some more comments in the chat. Thank you all so much. I'm just flagging if there's any questions we should address. All right, let us move on to discussion of economy and jobs.
Okay, so in the economy sector, many of the impacts here are the result of direct damages in other sectors. So here we show the impacts by the sector with direct damage. So for example, in the first column, we see the damage to structures in the infrastructure sector lead to economic losses to businesses. So for example, there could be lost sales and revenue while a store is closed following a flood. In the extreme weather and business interruption, we include all other impacts to businesses besides direct building damage. So for example, port and transportation closures that impact supply chain, power outages, and other closures due to extreme weather like snow days. In the next column, we see the impacts from natural environment damage, kind of following off some of the comments received on the last slide. Agriculture, marine fisheries, and aquaculture productivity are all directly impacted by the climate, but also are generally affected by impacts to natural environment and the supporting ecosystems. For example, the soil erosion around farmlands may make the land less productive, and loss of some food species in marine environments may cause movement of important fishery species. Also, much of the tourism and recreation in the region is tied to natural elements. Things like foliage viewing, beach recreation, fishing, and coastal landmarks are all vulnerable to climate change. And then finally, we have the economic impacts of the damages to human health. So with all of the health outcomes shown earlier, things like asthma, allergies, extreme temperature. There are economic costs as people miss work either while sick themselves or while caring for others. There's also studies that show that people work less and that are more at risk of injury when they're working during days with extreme heat. So we'll pause here for the economy sector.
Great. So I already see some questions and comments in the chat. There was one question about sort of, is extreme weather represented in each category because of how warmer weather adds energy to storms? And so Chris, I think, yes, when we're describing these sector impacts, they could be coming from multiple hazards, as Jackie described. So that includes warming temperatures, extreme weather, heavier, faster precipitation, et cetera. And many hazards can sort of drive these impacts that we see. And then Ellen is asking about impact on education in schools, and that affects work if parents have to be home. So yes, and again, that's kind of nested underneath. That's reflected in reduced ability to work. It was also captured in human health and welfare when people are unable to attend school or work or kind of go about their regular routines. Let me see. John is asking about economic disruptions outside of Massachusetts and how that can sort of trickle in via supply chain issues. Jackie, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think that is the type of thing that would be included in this extreme weather business interruptions category, where there could be evidence of, increasing incidences of disruption outside of the region that affect how businesses in the state can operate.
Thanks. I see Ben is sharing a resource about a tribal climate adaptation menu. Thank you. We'll definitely take a look at that. Issues of like supply chain disruption to be able to make repairs to all kinds of infrastructure, I'm thinking. Thank you. John is noting a decrease in outdoor thermal comfort from higher temperatures. Not only extreme heat waves, but just average can affect retail. Oh, great point. Extreme weather increases farm operation costs, requiring more undercover growing and irrigation. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, both Shayna and Ben raising questions about the term invasive. So we'll look into that guide, and also just thanks for flagging that. All right, any other questions on economy and jobs, or help for us to sort of describe with more nuance the impacts that are here? Okay, great. Thank you all for staying with us. This is a lot to get through. Appreciate your following along.
Yes, thank you. So the final sector is governance, and similar to the economy sector, this sector is also impacted by effects we see in other sectors. So damages to government buildings and land, both coastal and inland, will be assessed using the same methods as the general buildings impacts in the infrastructure sector, but we will restrict it to state and municipally owned structures. Another impact under revenue is state and municipal property tax revenues that can be lost, especially in coastal regions, as sea level rise threatens and damages coastal properties. And then the final section here on government expenditures recognizes that the state and municipal governments will have to pay much of the cost of addressing the impacts of climate change. So for example, increased expenditures on services the government already provides, such as costs of emergency response provision and state-sponsored health programs like Mass Health. Also, new and existing policies will need additional review as climate conditions change. Rules like building codes and land use ordinances may need to be re-examined, and this would require both additional staff and potentially additional training. These state and local governments will also need more staff to coordinate adaptation plans and actions. And then finally, as people move either within the state or from other areas, state and local governments in those receiving areas will be tasked with maintaining services and infrastructure for potentially rapidly growing populations.
Thank you. So Julie's raising a question that I think could be helpful for us to describe. She's asking about cascading impacts, and we realize like many of these impacts don't operate independently, they affect each other. So she's saying if buildings and facilities are damaged, that impacts the ability of everywhere else to continue to operate. So Jackie or Jim, do you want to talk about how we're able to sort of see the cumulative effects of multiple impacts or how they affect each other?
Maybe I can take this one, Jackie. I think that there are limitations in our ability to think about all the cascading impacts that might be associated with these sort of primary stressors. We will try. And I think in most cases, we can identify the links qualitatively more than we can quantify some of these links. But one of the things we do know about effects on government buildings from, for example, flooding, is that we know which buildings are most likely to be affected and which agencies they're associated with. And that's something that we will identify within the governance sector. So taking it to the next step and identifying the exact level of service is tricky, but we're going to try to identify at least what resources are most at risk, what government activities may be most at risk from these stressors.
Thank you. And there's a question about MWRA, and I'm not sure if that falls under sort of governance, state or municipal resources or more under infrastructure, but I'm sure we are attending to MWRA infrastructure.
The direct impacts, yes. We can identify MWRA ownership of specific facilities and whether they are subject to climate risks. And that's something we are doing within the governance sector.
Yeah, great. And yes, Beth, to your comment, we are considering the impacts to communications and emergency response, both the government's ability to administrate that and the sort of direct infrastructure interruptions, you know, if cell service goes down and other sort of, you know, are roads passable for emergency response to get out to people, et cetera. Thank you. And Tony, yes, this question of our municipal staff sort of sufficiently have enough capacity and knowledge to adapt the planning and the processes to a changing climate and sort of new demands, that is definitely an issue that is reflected here in governance. Thank you. Okay, any last comments or questions here on governance? Oh, Shalini is noting refugee considerations for climate migration. And Shalini, I'm not sure if you mean, I mean, I think there's many levels of climate migration that we want to be aware of, you know, pressures moving with people sort of moving within the state, people either leaving or coming to the state from within the US, and then to some degree, international climate refugees and migration. Jim, do you want to say sort of where we draw the lines of scope around all of those topics?
I could try. I think you covered it quite well. It's a very broad topic. And we have heard in other meetings that there's a real concern about in-state and within US migration away from hotspots of climate risk, for example, as well as the international focus. There is some existing literature that we can use to address some of these concerns, but mostly I think what we've heard is that the receiving communities are under stress, and we're going to try to identify that as best we can within this category. Yeah.
And maybe just the only other piece I would add is there's sort of social and sort of health impacts if communities are fragmented by needing to leave home and you don't anymore have the sort of social infrastructure supports of where you consider home, not to mention just the uprootedness of life if home isn't safe anymore. Great. Thank you so much for this helpful feedback and just, you know, teasing out. There's a lot that's captured, you know, when you have eight sort of broad categories to describe governance impacts, a lot is captured within. And thank you for raising other concerns that we need to be attentive to. All right. So I'm going to move us forward to just describe a little bit more the purpose of this phase of the assessment, this sort of prioritizing and determining who is affected, where, and how. And also ask you all to accept a small homework assignment of filling out our survey, which we can put in the chat again. So as Jackie's described, we have developed these sector lists of what we've heard is the most important to address, and you're continuing to help us refine our understanding there. And all of these impacts will be analyzed in the assessment, as well as the broader list that was raised during the first wave of meetings. And now we're looking for your help to further prioritize within those lists to help inform the adaptation planning process that follows this, to see what needs to be addressed first. So all of this is incredibly important, and we know we need adaptation action to respond to all of these. But we want to know, as we embark on the state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, what we need to be tackling first. So right now, I'm going to clarify how that prioritization is happening and hopefully get you primed in the mindset to respond to the survey. So as you can see, there are 3 main criteria we're using to help judge the urgency, how we need to prioritize an impact to address in our adaptation plan. So the first on the left there is how severe, how big is this impact? Will it affect everyone in the state? How significant is the threat? Second, is this an impact that will most heavily hit groups that are already vulnerable or disadvantaged? That tells us it needs more attention sooner to avoid sort of magnifying those inequalities and those vulnerabilities. And third, is it really important that we act now? Are the costs of inaction especially high, either because the impact is already being felt or because we're kind of behind in our planning? Or maybe it's a longer term impact, like the most sort of devastating severe effects of sea level rise, but we know that adapting will be especially kind of challenging and long and complex, so we need to get going. So these combine to create an overall score for each impact. And so we need your help to look at these impacts we've assembled and tell us what is most significant based on these criteria. And then in the survey, there's also room, a sort of open response field to tell us more about how you or your communities experience these impacts and what else we need to be thinking about, what concerns you for the future. So let me just pause to see if there's any questions on how we've described the impacts, what this process is that I just outlined right now. Again, feel free to put it in the chat or raise hand. Okay, great. Sounds like folks are coming along here. Let me move us forward then to get us ready to move into our discussion groups, where we really want, we'll be in smaller groups, so there's time to hear from everyone, which is really important. So again, what we want to highlight in these discussion groups is understanding what are culturally important places or activities. And so the way that we're approaching this conversation is to organize these discussion groups sort of loosely regionally. A lot of the impacts we experience differ by region, and a lot of how we need to think about adapting is also regional. So your input in this way will help us make the assessment better. And as I mentioned, one thing we haven't yet fully explored in the assessment is how climate change will impact kind of our cultural connection to where we live. So we want to ask you in these groups to discuss what places or activities or perhaps natural resources are important to you that may be affected by climate change. These could include sort of historical locations or monuments or natural environments or resources that you use or enjoy, either potentially for traditional purposes or for fun, or that help you connect to your community or your heritage. It could also be activities that you do that are significant to your culture that may be threatened by climate impacts. And just to kind of illustrate that further, these changes could be due to, for example, seasonal changes that affect ecology, or flooding, heat, or other extreme weather that makes it hard to enjoy a place, or even changes economically or effects on businesses that impact like our opportunities to do recreation and impact the places we go to have fun. So any questions on that topic and that prompt? Okay, great. I'm going to move us into those discussion groups now, and there will be a facilitator in each of those groups, so you all can ask questions there if need be, and hope you have a great conversation. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for your patience and thanks for sticking with us. I know it can always be odd to be suddenly yanked from one room back to another, such as Zoom life. We're just gonna take a moment to wrap up, let you know where we're going from here. And just before we do, I noticed that there was one quick question in the chat before we jumped into breakouts that I just wanted to address since it feels significant. And then I'll turn it over to Margot to talk about next steps. But I believe it may have been John who was talking about sort of resilience and adaptive capacity of socially vulnerable groups. And John and others, just to clarify, it's true. We're not only looking at the severity of the impact, but the need to avoid further burdening populations that are already sort of dealing with multiple environmental justice or other concerns, and also attending to the fact that there are some groups who have a harder time getting out of the way of disasters or extreme weather, or even just sort of chronic heat and issues like that. Jackie or Jim, anything to add on that?
I think I covered it well, Elizabeth. Yeah. It's a complex topic, and adaptive capacity is a very difficult thing to assess, but I think we come into this with some understanding that adaptive capacity is a real challenge for most socially vulnerable communities, and it's more nuanced than just saying that particular conclusion, that in fact some socially vulnerable communities have a higher level of social capital and social capacity to adapt, and those things are all part of the equation.
No easy answers. Thank you. Margot, let me turn it over to you to wrap us up.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again, everyone, for your time and your efforts today. I know we had some great conversations in the breakout group I was in, hoping that you found the same in your respective groups. Again, this is a critical step to help us move forward with the next phase of the assessment. And to that end, we invite you to provide any additional input during this phase via a post-meeting Zoom evaluation, and to echo Elizabeth's earlier calls to complete a survey that complements our discussion this morning. We are holding additional public conversations this week. We had one yesterday, and we welcome your help encouraging others to join one of the remaining sessions. We have an evening offering tonight and an afternoon offering on Saturday. In terms of next steps, we anticipate a public comment period on the draft climate change assessment report in September, leading to a finalized report tentatively in October. The results of this report will be incorporated into the 2023 update of the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. So just thank you again for your time and support on this effort, and hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Your feedback will definitely help us enrich and describe better these impacts in the assessment, and your replies in the survey will help us do that prioritization effort. And then in the post-meeting evaluation, we also welcome any feedback about how this conversation went. We'd love to know so we can adapt as needed for future conversations, how to make this work well for folks. And someone's asking about if this recording, yes, Julie, we will post a recording of these conversations to that website that was just linked. We're holding this meeting 4 times, so we may not post all 4 recordings, but at least one of them will be made available. Any other last comments here? Anyway, John, thanks for your follow-up, and happy to keep chatting with you about it if that would be helpful, and really appreciate your help refining here. Okay, have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much. Sorry to run a minute over. Take care.
Thank you.